Andrew Collins sat in his parked car outside Mitchell and Associates, staring at the text message that had just lit up his phone screen. His hands trembled slightly as he read it again. "Baby's here. Room 412, St. Mary's Hospital. Can't wait for you to meet our little one." Lacey, 9 months of anticipation had culminated in this moment. He glanced at his watch. The quarterly report he'd been working on could wait. This was the day he'd become a father. "Tom," he called out, practically running into his colleague's office. "The baby's here. I've got to go." Tom looked up from his computer, grinning broadly. "Well, what are you still doing here? Go meet your kid." Andrew was already backing out the door, his suit jacket half on. "Cover for me with Davidson. Consider it done. Now get out of here, Dad." The word Dad sent a thrill through Andrew's chest as he hurried through the office. He'd been someone's husband for 5 years, but fatherhood was a new title he couldn't wait to claim. He loosened his blue silk tie, the one Lacey had given him for their anniversary last year. The memory of that evening flooded back, how they'd celebrated by discussing baby names over dinner, arguing playfully about whether they wanted a boy or a girl. Lacey had been adamant about waiting to find out the gender, wanting it to be a surprise. Like Christmas morning, she'd said, her green eyes sparkling with excitement. The elevator doors opened to the parking garage, and Andrew rushed to his car, fumbling with his keys in his haste. As he slid into the driver's seat, his eyes fell on the stuffed bear sitting in the passenger seat. He had bought a week ago a soft, cream-colored teddy bear wearing a tiny blue bow tie. The sight brought back the day he and Lacey had painted the nursery, how she teased him about being too perfectionist with the corners. "The baby won't care if the stripes aren't perfectly straight," she laughed, a smudge of yellow paint on her cheek. He smiled at the memory as he pulled out of the parking garage into the bright afternoon sun. Traffic was light for a Thursday, and he silently thanked whatever forces were responsible for that small mercy. His mind wandered to the last 9 months. The doctor's appointments, the birthing classes, the late-night ice cream runs to satisfy Lacey's cravings. It had been a journey they'd shared together. Andrew thought the drive to St. Mary's Hospital took exactly 17 minutes. He knew because he counted every one of them. His excitement built with each passing moment. He'd driven this route dozens of times for checkups and ultrasounds, but this time felt different. This time, he would leave the hospital as a father. The parking lot was busy, but Andrew managed to find a spot close to the entrance. As he grabbed the teddy bear from the passenger seat, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his mother-in-law. "Surely you are almost here." Something about the message felt off. No congratulations, no excitement, just a simple question. Andrew brushed off the feeling, attributing it to his mother-in-law's typically direct communication style. "Just parked," he texted back, then pocketed his phone. The automatic doors whooshed open as he approached, releasing a blast of cool, air-conditioned air. The hospital lobby was bustling with activity. Visitors carrying flowers and balloons, staff in scrubs hurrying past, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors. Andrew nodded to the volunteer at the information desk, already knowing his way to the maternity ward. He found himself sharing the space with an elderly couple carrying a pink balloon that proclaimed, "It's a girl." The woman smiled at him, noticing the teddy bear in his hands. "First time?" she asked kindly. Andrew nodded, unable to suppress his grin. "Is it that obvious?" "You have that look," the man chuckled. "Same when I had ours 40 years ago, when our first came along." "Nothing quite like it," Martha agreed, squeezing her husband's hand. The elevator stopped at the 4th floor, and Andrew let the couple exit first. As he stepped out into the hallway, the familiar antiseptic smell of the hospital mixed with the scent of flowers from various rooms. His shoes squeaked against the freshly waxed floor as he made his way down the corridor, following the signs to room 412. The maternity ward was quieter than the main lobby, with nurses speaking in hushed tones and the occasional cry of a newborn echoing from behind closed doors. Andrew's pace quickened as he approached Lacey's room. His heart raced with anticipation, Then he saw Shirley, his mother-in-law, standing outside room 412. Her usually warm face was etched with worry. She wore a navy blue dress that seemed somehow more severe than her usual style, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. When she spotted him, something flickered across her face. "Andrew," she said, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "I think you should wait out here for a moment." He felt his smile fade, replaced by a frown of confusion. "What? Why? Is something wrong with the baby? With Lacey?" Shirley's face tightened. "It's complicated. Just give me a few minutes to talk to Lacey first." A cold feeling spread through Andrew's chest, completely at odds with the excitement he'd felt moments ago. He'd known Shirley for 5 years, ever since he'd started dating Lacey. She'd always been warm and welcoming, treating him like the son she never had. But now, no, he said firmly, taking a step forward. "That's my wife and my child in there. I'm not waiting." Shirley's hand shot out, pressing against his chest. "Please, Andrew, listen to me." "Listen to what?" His voice rose slightly, drawing a sharp look from a passing nurse. He lowered it, continuing, "Shirley, you're scaring me." "What's going on?" "I'm trying to protect you both," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Just give me 5 minutes with her." Andrew studied her face, noting the strain around her eyes and the slight tremor in her hand as she held it against his chest. "Protect us from what?" he demanded, his patience wearing thin. "Shirley, move aside." "Andrew, wait," she pleaded as he pushed past her, his larger frame easily breaking her attempt to block him. The teddy bear dropped from his hands as he grabbed the door handle, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Behind him, he heard Shirley take a breath, but he was already pushing the door open. The first thing that struck him was how normal everything seemed. The room was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere. There were flowers on the windowsill, roses, he noted absently, probably from Lacey's sister. The steady beep of monitors created a rhythmic background noise, almost soothing in its regularity. Lacey lay in the hospital bed, her chestnut hair damp with sweat and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired but beautiful, cradling a bundle of white hospital blankets in her arms. For one perfect moment, the scene matched exactly what he imagined countless times over the past 9 months. Then he saw the baby's face. Andrew felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The child in Lacey's arms was clearly biracial, with beautiful brown skin that contrasted sharply against the white hospital blanket. He stared, unable to process what he was seeing. His mind refused to accept the obvious truth before him. Lacey looked up, her face draining of color. "Andrew," she whispered, clutching the baby closer to her chest. "I can explain." "Explain?" The word came out as a whisper. He took a step forward, then back, as if his body couldn't decide whether to approach or flee. "Explain what, Lacey?" "How our child? How my child?" The words died in his throat, tears welling up in Lacey's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Please, baby, just listen to me. It was a mistake. One terrible mistake." Andrew's voice rose, causing the baby to stir. "Getting the wrong coffee order is a mistake. Forgetting an anniversary is a mistake. This," he gestured at the child, "is a choice, a series of choices. Choices you made every time you decided to." She slipped into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. "Keep your voice down," she urged. "This isn't the place for you to know." Andrew turned on her, his eyes blazing. "You knew this would happen. That's why you tried to stop me from coming in. How long have you known?" "I just found out when the baby was born," Lacey defended, but her eyes wouldn't meet his. "I was trying to protect everyone, to give Lacey a chance to tell you properly." Andrew laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that seemed to bounce off the hospital walls. "Protect everyone? Where was this protection when your daughter was cheating on me? When she was lying to my face for months?" "Lacey, please," she begged, her voice cracking. We can work through this. We can raise this baby together. All you have to do is sign the birth certificate." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, wondering if he'd ever really known her at all. "Sign the birth certificate. You want me to claim a child that isn't mine, to take responsibility for your infidelity." "You're my husband," Lacey said, her voice growing stronger even as tears continued to fall. "We made vows to each other in sickness and in health, for better or worse. Those vows included faithfulness." Andrew cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. "Or did you forget that part while you were sleeping with someone else?" The baby began to cry. It filled the tense silence that followed. Lacey rocked the child gently, making soft shushing sounds while Shirley moved to her daughter's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "The birth certificate needs to be filled out," Shirley said quietly. "As her husband, you're legally—" "I'm not signing anything," Andrew declared firmly despite the tremor in his hands. "Not without a DNA test." Lacey's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A DNA test? You would really do that to me? To your child? Look at that baby." "We both know it's not mine," Andrew stated, running a hand through his hair, disturbing its usual neat appearance. "How long? What? How long have you been cheating on me? Was it a one-time thing? Or have you been lying to me our entire marriage?" Lacey's face crumpled. "It wasn't like that. It just happened a few times. I never meant for—" "For what?" Andrew interrupted. "For me to find out. For the truth to be so obvious that you couldn't hide it." Andrew paced the small room, feeling like a caged animal. "Who is he?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lacey looked down at the baby, avoiding his gaze while shifting uncomfortably beside her. "You know what? Don't tell me. I don't want to know." Andrew stopped pacing. His wedding rings suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "I'm not signing that birth certificate. Not now. Not ever. You want someone's name on that document. Put the real father's name on it. You can't just walk away." Lacey protested, her voice rising with desperation. "This is your responsibility, too. We're married." Andrew turned back, his eyes cold. "My responsibility? You destroyed our marriage. Tried to trick me into raising another man's child. And you have the audacity to talk about responsibility." "Lacey, please," she sobbed. "I love you. We can get past this. We can love again." He cut her off, his voice thick with disgust. "If this is your version of love, I want no part of it. You didn't just cheat on me, Lacey. You were going to let me believe this child was mine. You were going to watch me raise it, love it, all while knowing the truth. What kind of person does that?" "I was scared," she whispered. "I didn't want to lose you." "Well, congratulations," Andrew said, eerily calm. "You just did." He reached the door, his hand gripping the handle so tight his knuckles turned white. The teddy bear still lay where he dropped it, its cheerful blue bow tie now seeming like a cruel joke. "My lawyer will be in touch about the DNA test," he said, not turning around. "And Lacey, don't try to put my name on that birth certificate. That would be fraud. I will fight it with everything I have." With those words, he pulled open the door and walked out. The sound of Lacey's sobs followed him down the hallway, mixing with the baby's cries. But he didn't look back. His footsteps echoed through the corridor as he made his way to the elevator. Each step took him further from the life he thought he had, from the future he planned. The elderly couple from earlier was getting off the elevator as he approached the pink balloon bobbing cheerfully between them. The woman's smile faded as she saw his face, but Andrew barely noticed. He stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the lobby with more force than necessary. In the mirrored walls, he caught his reflection. The man who had entered the hospital less than an hour ago, excited, happy, ready to embrace fatherhood, was gone. In his place stood someone else, someone whose trust had been shattered, whose world had been turned upside down. As he walked through the hospital lobby, The afternoon sun still shone brightly outside, but Andrew barely noticed it. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his next steps. He would need a lawyer. He would need proof. He would need to protect himself from whatever Lacey might try next. He reached his car and sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping it tightly. The emptiness of the passenger seat where the teddy bear had been seemed to mock him. His phone buzzed, probably Lacey or Shirley, but he ignored it. One thing was certain: he would never forgive this betrayal. Never. The front door slammed behind Andrew with enough force to rattle the family photos lining the hallway wall. One frame tilted precariously, their wedding photo with Lacey and him in his black tuxedo, both smiling at a future that now lay in ruins. He reached out automatically to straighten it, then stopped, his hand hovering in midair. Instead, he grabbed the frame and slammed it face down on the side table. The house felt different now, tainted. Everything he looked at held memories that suddenly felt poisoned. The cream-colored couch where they'd spent countless evenings watching movies. The kitchen where they'd cooked together, dancing to old songs on the radio. The nursery upstairs that he'd spent weekends perfecting, believing he was preparing for his child. His tie felt like it was choking him. He yanked it off with trembling hands, throwing it onto the kitchen counter. It landed next to the pregnancy calendar Lacey had been keeping, each week meticulously marked with the baby's development milestones. He stared at it, wondering how many of those weeks she'd spent with him, and how many with her phone buzzed again. The screen lit up with yet another call from Lacey, the 17th since he'd left the hospital. Between her and Shirley, they'd bombarded him with messages. "Please come back. We need to talk about this. Don't make any hasty decisions. Think about the baby. Let me explain everything." Andrew scrolled through them, each message stoking his anger higher. The last one from Lacey made him clench his jaw. "The baby needs a father," he thought, before muttering, tossing the phone onto the couch. His feet carried him to Lacey's home office, a small room just off the living room that still held traces of her vanilla perfume. Pregnancy books and parenting magazines littered her desk, their cheerful covers now seeming to mock him. But Andrew wasn't interested in those, his eyes fixed on her laptop, sitting closed on the desk where she'd left it yesterday morning. Had it only been yesterday when everything was normal? When I kissed her goodbye, my hand resting on her pregnant belly, believing I was touching my child. "Time to see what other lies you've been telling," he said to the empty room, pulling out the desk chair and sitting down. The laptop hummed to life, the password prompt appearing on screen. He typed in their anniversary date, 9/22, the same password she'd used for years. The screen unlocked immediately. His hands hesitated over the keyboard. Did he really want to know? Could the truth be worse than what he was imagining? Looking for something, Andrew spun around, startled. Tom stood in the doorway, still in his work suit, concern etched on his face. "How did you get in?" "Spare key, remember? The one you gave me last year when you went on that business trip." Tom stepped into the room, his eyes taking in Andrew's disheveled appearance. "You weren't answering your phone. And after you left work like that, I was worried." Andrew's laugh was harsh, brittle. "What happened?" "I'll tell you what happened. I want to meet my child today, except it wasn't my child. Turns out my wife has been busy with someone else." Jesus Christ. Tom moved further into the room, dropping his briefcase by the door. "Are you sure?" The baby's biracial, Tom. Kind of hard to miss that detail when both Lacey and I are white. Shit. Tom ran a hand through his hair, messing up his usually neat appearance. "What are you going to do?" "Right now." Andrew turned back to the laptop. "I'm going to find out exactly what else my loving wife has been hiding." It didn't take long to find the evidence. In her email drafts folder, he found messages to someone named Javier. Dozens of them, spanning months. "Dozens of them," Andrew said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Javier, we need to talk about what happens when the baby comes." Andrew couldn't know it would destroy everything. I think it's best if you keep your distance for a while. Tom moved closer, reading over his shoulder. Check the date on that one. 3 months ago. Andrew clicked through more messages. Here's another one. I know this isn't fair to you, but please understand. Andrew's a good man. He'll be a wonderful father. We just need to give it time. She was planning this the whole time. Looks that way. Andrew's fingers clenched on the mouse. She was trying to convince me to stay away, probably hoping I'd never notice. They were both going to watch me raise his child, knowing the truth the whole time. You need a lawyer, Tom said firmly. Like yesterday. Already on it. Andrew pulled out his phone, ignoring 3 new messages from Lacey. He dialed the number and put it on speaker. James Morrison's office. A crisp voice answered. This is Andrew Collins. I need to speak with James immediately. It's urgent. 1 moment, please. While they waited, Tom paced the room. What about the birth certificate? Did she try to get you to sign it? Oh, she did more than try. Andrew's jaw clenched at the memory. Tried to guilt me into it with some nonsense about marriage vows and responsibility. As if I'm responsible for her affair. Mr. Collins, a new voice came through the speaker. James Morrison here. What can I do for you? I need your help, James. My wife just gave birth to another man's child and tried to get me to sign the birth certificate. There was a brief pause. Are you certain about paternity? The baby's clearly biracial. Neither my wife nor I are. I see papers rustled in the background. Don't sign anything. Not the birth certificate, not hospital forms. Nothing. I'm clearing my schedule for the rest of the afternoon. Can you come to my office in an hour? I'll be there. And Andrew, start documenting everything. Every conversation. Every text message. Save any emails or evidence you find. We'll need it all. After hanging up, Andrew turned back to the laptop. I need to copy these emails. Let me help, Tom offered, pulling out a USB drive from his briefcase. We should document everything systematically. Create a timeline. They worked in silence for several minutes, saving emails and taking screenshots. Then Andrew's phone rang again. Lacey, you should answer it, Tom suggested. Record the conversation. Could be useful later. Andrew nodded, activating his phone's recording feature before answering. What? Andrew, please. Lacey's voice was hoarse from crying. You can't just disappear like this. We need to talk. I need to explain. Talk about what? How you've been cheating on me. How you were going to trick me into raising another man's child. Or maybe you want to explain all those lovely emails to Javier. There was a sharp intake of breath. What emails? Have you been going through my private things? Andrew's laugh was cold. Like your private affair. Your private plan to commit paternity fraud. It's not fraud. I made a mistake. But a mistake. Andrew's voice rose. Was it a mistake when you slept with him? When you got pregnant? When you spent months planning to deceive me? I was scared. I didn't know what to do. How about telling the truth? Or is that concept too difficult for you to grasp? There was a pause. Then Lacey's voice turned harder. The hospital needs the birth certificate filed. They're asking questions. We need to handle this. Not my problem. It is your problem. You're my husband. Legally, I'm requesting a DNA test before signing anything. And Lacey, I've seen the emails to Javier. All of them, including the ones where you planned how to keep him quiet while I raised the child. The silence on the other end was deafening. When Lacey spoke again, her voice trembled. You don't understand. Javier doesn't want. Doesn't want what? Responsibility. Funny how that works, isn't it? Well, guess what? Neither do I. Not for your lies. Not for your affair. And definitely not for another man's child. The hospital's pushing for the paperwork. Lacey's voice turned desperate. They need it filed today. Please, Andrew. We can work through this. We can get counseling. The only thing we're getting is divorce. My lawyer will be in touch about the DNA test. Your lawyer? Her voice cracked. Andrew, please don't do this. We can work this out. The baby needs a father. The baby has a father. His name is Javier. Put his name on the birth certificate. I can't. He doesn't want. Lacey stopped abruptly. He doesn't want to be involved. Shocking. Well, that's between you and him now. I want no part of it. You're really going to do this? Lacey's voice hardened. After 5 years of marriage, you're just going to walk away. No, Lacey, you did this. You walked away the moment you decided to be with another man. You destroyed our marriage with every lie you told, every time you met him, every moment you planned to deceive me. And now you're going to face the consequences. Is that what you want? To punish me? What I want is the truth. For once in your life, try telling it. Put Javier's name on the birth certificate. Take responsibility for your choices. And if I don't, there was a challenge in her voice now. What if I put your name down anyway? Then I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. Every email, every lie, every detail of your affair, all of it will come out in court. How do you think that will look? A fraud charge on your record? Your reputation in ruins? You wouldn't dare. Try me. The line went silent for a moment. I'm sorry, Lacey finally whispered. I never meant to hurt you, but you did. Every day you lied. Every time you met him. Every moment you planned to deceive me. You chose to hurt me. And now you're going to face the consequences. He ended the call, his hands shaking. Tom stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. You okay? No. Andrew looked at his friend. But I will be. After I make sure she can't get away with this. An hour later, Andrew sat in James Morrison's office, watching the lawyer review the evidence they'd gathered. James was a tall man with gray-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on his nose. His office walls were lined with law books and certificates, speaking to decades of experience. He scrolled through the emails, his expression growing grimmer with each one. Well, James, Andrew finally said, removing his glasses and placing them carefully on his desk. She certainly made our job easier with these emails. Clear evidence of intent to deceive. What are my options? First, we file for the DNA test immediately. Given the visible evidence of non-paternity, no judge will deny that request. Once we have the results, we can prevent her from listing you as the father. And if she tries anyway, then we file fraud charges. James leaned forward, his expression serious. But Andrew, you need to be prepared. She might get desperate. People often do in these situations. What do you mean? She might try to claim you knew about the affair and that you agreed to raise the child anyway. Or she might attempt to manipulate you emotionally. Use your history together against you. 5 years of marriage gives her a lot of ammunition. Andrew's jaw clenched. I won't fall for it. Good. James began typing on his computer. I'm drafting the DNA test request now. We'll have it filed within the hour. In the meantime, document everything. Every call, every text, every interaction. And Andrew looked up seriously. Stay away from the hospital. Any contact should go through me. Not a problem. Andrew stood, straightening his jacket. I never want to see her again. Over the next few weeks, Andrew threw himself into building his case. The DNA test was scheduled and completed with clinical efficiency. He avoided the hospital entirely, letting his lawyer handle all communication. Each day brought new messages from Lacey and her family, alternating between pleas and threats. Please just talk to me. You're being unreasonable. Think about what you're throwing away. You'll regret this. He saved them all without responding, building a file of evidence that grew thicker by the day. Tom stopped by regularly, bringing food and offering support. While James kept him updated on the legal proceedings, the test results arrived. Andrew sat in James's office, staring at the paper that confirmed what he'd known from the moment he saw the baby. The numbers were clear. Definitively, The child was not his. There was zero chance of paternity. What now? He asked, looking up at his lawyer. Now we move forward with the divorce proceedings. The DNA test proves non-paternity, so she can't legally name you as the father. But James, Andrew paused, his expression serious. She's already tried. What? She filed a birth certificate yesterday, listed you as the father. The paper crumpled in Andrew's fist. After everything, after the DNA test, she's desperate. James said calmly, but this works in our favor. We can now add attempted fraud to the divorce filing. The penalties for knowingly falsifying a birth certificate are significant. Andrew's phone buzzed. Lacey again. This time he answered. How dare you? She hissed before he could speak. The hospital called about your lawyer's letter. A fraud complaint. Really? You listed me as the father after a DNA test proved I'm not. What would you call it? I call it you abandoning your responsibilities. Your family, my family. Andrew's laugh was bitter. You destroyed any chance of that when you decided to be with another man, when you tried to trap me into raising his child. I was trying to keep us together by lying, by committing fraud, she said quietly. Face it, Lacey. You weren't trying to keep us together. You were trying to protect yourself to avoid facing the consequences of your actions. What do you want from me? Her voice cracked. The truth. For once in your life, try telling the truth. Put Javier's name on the birth certificate. Take responsibility for your choices. He won't help, she admitted quietly. He wants nothing to do with us. He's blocked my number. You won't return my calls. Not my problem. You chose him. Remember. Now deal with it. He ended the call, turning back to James. What's our next step? We file a fraud complaint, James said, already pulling up documents on his computer. Between the DNA test, the emails, and her filing a false birth certificate, we have a strong case. She'll face fines, possibly community service. Good. Andrew stood, his decision firm. File everything. I want her to face every possible consequence for what she's done, and the divorce as fast as possible. I want this over. As he left the lawyer's office, Andrew felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth was out, documented in black and white. Lacey's lies were exposed, her attempts at manipulation thwarted. She would face the consequences of her actions, and he would be free. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Lacey. He deleted it without reading it. Some betrayals went too deep for forgiveness, some lies too far for redemption. She had made her choices, and now she would live with them, just as he would live with his. Never to trust her again, never to forgive, never to forget. The Suffolk County Courthouse loomed against the morning sky, its imposing stone facade catching the early September light. Andrew stood at the bottom of the granite steps, adjusting the knot of his navy blue tie, a new one purchased after he'd thrown everything Lacey had ever given him. The autumn air carried a hint of chill, matching the cold determination in his heart. Tom pulled up in his black BMW, parking smoothly at the curb. He stepped out, also wearing a crisp suit, his expression serious. Thought you might want backup, he said, joining Andrew at the steps. Thanks. Andrew checked his watch. 8:45 am. James said to meet him at 9. Nervous? Andrew shook his head. No, just ready for this to be over. As if summoned by their conversation, James Morrison appeared at the top of the steps, his silver hair catching the sunlight. The lawyer descended to meet them, his leather briefcase polished to a shine. They're already inside, James informed them. James, what about him? Andrew asked, his voice hardening. Is Javier going to show his face? James shook his head. No sign of him. According to my sources, he's left the state entirely. Moved to Arizona last month. Coward, Tom muttered, echoing Andrew's thoughts. Better this way, James said pragmatically. His absence only strengthens our case about abandonment, and Lacey's desperate attempts to find a replacement father. They climbed the courthouse steps together, Andrew's shoes clicking against the granite. Inside, they passed through security, the metal detector beeping as Andrew emptied his pockets into the plastic tray. The marble hallway stretched before them, their reflections ghosting along the polished floor as they walked to the courtroom. James paused, turning to face Andrew. "A few final points," the lawyer said quietly. "Let me do most of the talking. When you're called to testify, stick to the facts. Don't let emotion." "I won't." Andrew cut him off, his voice steady. "Trust me, I want everyone to hear exactly what she did. Calmly, clearly, no drama needed. The truth is damning enough. The DNA results and emails are our strongest evidence. Combined with her attempted filing of the fraudulent birth certificate, it paints a clear picture of intent to deceive." "James," Tom asked, "what kind of defense is she planning?" "From what I've heard, they're going for emotional distress and temporary poor judgment. Her lawyer, Victoria Parker, is known for turning criminal cases into emotional appeals." Andrew's jaw tightened. "She can try, but emails planning deception months in advance don't sound very temporary to me." They pushed through the doors into the courtroom. The room was smaller than Andrew had expected, with dark wood paneling and rows of wooden benches. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Lacey sat at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s wearing a charcoal gray suit. The past months hadn't been kind to Lacey. Her normally perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Shirley occupied the first row behind them, her face drawn with worry, hands clutching a tissue as Andrew entered. Lacey's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, he saw a flash of their old connection, 5 years of shared life and love. Then he remembered the emails, the lies, the betrayal, and his heart hardened again. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Margaret Chin entered. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair pulled back severely from her face, her dark eyes sharp and alert behind rectangular glasses. "We're here today regarding the matter of Collins versus Collins," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, specifically addressing charges of attempted paternity fraud. "Mr. Morrison, you may proceed with your opening statement." James stood, smoothly buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, this is a clear and egregious case of attempted paternity fraud. The evidence will show that Mrs. Collins not only engaged in an extramarital affair resulting in pregnancy, but also attempted to deceive my client into accepting paternity of a child that DNA testing has conclusively proved is not his. Furthermore, after receiving these DNA results, Mrs. Collins still attempted to file a birth certificate naming my client as the father, a deliberate and calculated act of fraud." He gestured to the evidence boxes on their table. "We will present emails showing months of premeditation, DNA results confirming non-paternity, and documentation of Mrs. Collins' attempt to file false information on a legal document." This was not a moment of confusion or desperation, but a carefully planned deception that would have trapped my client in decades of financial and emotional responsibility for another man's child. He gestured toward Andrew. "My client came to the hospital that day expecting to meet his child. Instead, he discovered a web of lies that destroyed his marriage and threatened his future. We ask the court to hold Mrs. Collins accountable for her actions and send a clear message that paternity fraud is not a solution to personal problems." Ms. Parker rose smoothly. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges errors in judgment regarding her personal life, her actions were driven by fear and a desperate desire to preserve her marriage, not malicious intent. She is a first-time mother who made choices under extreme emotional duress, facing abandonment by the biological father and fearing the destruction of her family." "Poor judgment," Andrew muttered under his breath. "That's what they're calling fraud now." Tom placed a warning hand on his arm. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Chin directed, "call your first witness." The plaintiff calls Andrew Collins to the stand. Andrew walked to the witness box, feeling Lacey's eyes on him the whole way. The bailiff approached with a Bible, and Andrew placed his hand on it, swearing to tell the truth, something his wife had forgotten how to do after being sworn in. Andrew sat facing the courtroom, his posture straight and determined. The wooden chair was uncomfortable, but he welcomed the discomfort. It helped him stay focused. "Mr. Collins," James began as he approached the witness stand, "please tell the court about the events of June 15th when your wife gave birth." "I was at work when I received a text from Lacey telling me to come to St. Mary's Hospital," Andrew testified, his voice clear and controlled. "When I arrived at room 412, I found my mother-in-law, Shirley, attempting to prevent me from entering. Upon pushing past her and entering the room, I discovered that the baby was clearly biracial, while both Lacey and I are white." "And what was your immediate reaction?" "Objection, Ms. Parker," she interrupted. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," James said smoothly. "What did you do next, Mr. Collins?" "I asked Lacey for an explanation. She admitted to having an affair, but tried to convince me to sign the birth certificate despite the obvious evidence that I couldn't be the father." "How did she attempt to convince you?" Andrew's jaw tightened slightly. "She tried to use our marriage vows against me, saying it was my responsibility as her husband to accept the child, regardless of paternity. When I refused and requested a DNA test, she became hostile and manipulative." "Objection, Your Honor," Ms. Parker called out. "Characterization." "I'll rephrase," Andrew said before the judge could respond. "She started threatening me with legal action if I didn't sign, saying she would put my name on the certificate whether I agreed or not." James walked to his table and picked up a thick folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit A. Emails recovered from Mrs. Collins' computer, showing correspondence with the biological father over a period of several months." "Objection, Ms. Parker," she stood. "Those emails were obtained without my client's consent. This constitutes an invasion of privacy." "Your Honor," James countered, "the computer was shared marital property used by both parties throughout their marriage. Furthermore, Mrs. Collins used Mr. Collins' anniversary as her password, indicating no expectation of privacy. The emails were discovered during routine use of a shared device." Judge Chin considered briefly. "Overruled. The emails will be admitted. Proceed, Mr. Morrison." James handed the printouts to Andrew. "Please read the highlighted portion from the email dated March 12, 3 months before the birth." Andrew cleared his throat and read, "Javier, we need to talk about what happens when the baby comes. Andrew can't know, it would destroy everything. I think it's best if you keep your distance for a while." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Andrew looked directly at Lacey as he read, watching her sink lower in her chair, her face pale. "And when was this email written?" James prompted. 3 months before the birth, and approximately 6 months after she became pregnant." "Weren't there other emails?" "Yes, dozens of them, spanning several months. They discussed how to keep the affair hidden, how to handle the birth, and plans to deceive me into raising the child as my own." James nodded, and the DNA test results showed zero possibility of paternity. Andrew stated firmly. Yet, the day after receiving these results, Lacey attempted to file a birth certificate naming me as the father. Ms. Parker stood for cross-examination, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached, her perfume, something expensive and floral, wafting over the witness stand. "Mr. Collins," she began gently, "in 5 years of marriage, had my client ever given you reason to doubt her before?" "No," Andrew admitted. "She was very good at lying." "Objection, Your Honor," Ms. Parker said. "Non-responsive." "Sustained," Judge Chin agreed. "The witness will limit answers to the questions asked." "I'll rephrase," Ms. Parker continued. "Mr. Collins, would you say your marriage was happy before this incident?" "I thought it was clearly. I was wrong." "And when you discovered the truth about the baby, did you make any attempt to discuss the situation with my client, to understand her perspective?" "What was there to discuss?" The evidence of her infidelity was literally in her arms. Did you consider marriage counseling? Working through this as a couple? Work through what? The months of lies, the careful planning to deceive me, the attempt to trap me into raising another man's child. Objection, James called out. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Chin nodded. Ms. Parker, please keep your questions focused. Mr. Collins, Ms. Parker tried again. Isn't it true that you abandoned my client at the hospital? That you refused to even discuss the situation? I refused to participate in fraud. Andrew corrected. I left the hospital when your client tried to coerce me into assigning a false birth certificate. Then I contacted a lawyer to protect my rights. And you never considered forgiveness. The possibility of preserving your marriage. Forgiveness. Andrew leaned forward slightly. Your client didn't just have an affair. She planned to deceive me into raising another man's child. She wrote emails plotting how to keep her affair hidden, how to manipulate me into accepting a situation based on lies. Objection. Ms. Parker shifted tactics. Mr. Collins, you and my client were trying to have a child for some time before this incident, weren't you? We were, Andrew acknowledged. There were difficulties conceiving. Objection. James interrupted. Relevance? Goes to state of mind, Ms. Parker argued. Your Honor, she continued, the context of their fertility struggles is important to understanding my client's actions. I'll allow it, Judge Chin ruled. But keep it brief. Mr. Collins, Ms. Parker continued, isn't it possible that my client's actions, while misguided, came from a place of desperation, of wanting to give you the family you both desired? Andrew's eyes hardened. No, Mrs. Parker, it's not possible. Your client's actions came from a place of selfishness and deception. She wasn't thinking about what I desired. She was thinking about what she could get away with. That's quite an assumption about her motivations. It's not an assumption. It's written in her own words. Andrew gestured to the emails. She didn't write about giving me a family. She wrote about how to keep her affair hidden, how to manipulate me into accepting a situation based on lies. The questioning continued, but Andrew remained composed, answering each attempt to paint him as unreasonable with clear factual responses. When he finally stepped down, he caught Tom's approving nod from the gallery. Lacey was called next. She walked to the witness stand with confidence, but Andrew noticed how her hands twisted nervously in her lap, a gesture he'd seen countless times during their marriage, usually when she was hiding something. Mrs. Collins, Ms. Parker began gently. Please explain to the court what led to your actions. I was scared, Lacey said, her voice trembling slightly. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew it might be Javier's, but I hoped it might be Andrew's. We've been trying for a baby for so long, going through fertility treatments, dealing with disappointment month after month. And when I realized the truth about the paternity, I panicked. Tears welled in her eyes. Javier wanted nothing to do with us. He said he never wanted children, and that his career came first. I thought if I just kept quiet, if Andrew never knew, he would have been such a wonderful father. Objection, James called out. Speculation and irrelevant. Sustained, Judge Chin agreed. Mrs. Collins, Ms. Parker redirected. Why did you attempt to file the birth certificate with Mr. Collins's name? I was alone. Scared. The hospital was pressuring me for the paperwork, and Javier had blocked my number. I didn't know what else to do. Even after the DNA test results, I thought maybe if he just had time to think about it, to calm down. Lacey's voice cracked. We were happy once. We could have been happy again. James stood for cross-examination, his expression stern. Mrs. Collins, you claim you were scared, yet your emails show careful planning over several months. You deliberately orchestrated this deception, didn't you? I was trying to protect my marriage by lying, by attempting to commit fraud. A mistake is an accident, Mrs. Collins. You made choices, multiple choices over multiple months to deceive your husband. James picked up one of the emails. In this message from April, you wrote to Mr. Ramirez, and I quote, "We need to be careful. Andrew can't suspect anything. Once he signs the birth certificate, everything will be easier." Does that sound like panic to you? Or does it sound like premeditation? Lacey's composure cracked. What was I supposed to do? Javier abandoned us. I needed help. You needed to trap my client into financial responsibility for another man's child. James finished coldly. In fact, let's talk about Mr. Ramirez. When did the affair begin? Last summer at a company conference in Chicago, and it continued for a few months. Lacey, James continued, during which time you were actively trying to conceive with my client. Yes, so you were aware of the possibility of pregnancy by another man. Yet you continued to let my client believe any child would be his. I didn't think exactly. You didn't think about the consequences. You didn't think about the legal implications. You didn't think about how this deception would affect my client. James paused. Tell me, Mrs. Collins, did Mr. Ramirez know about your plan to name my client as the father? Lacey's face crumpled. Yes. He agreed it would be better that way. He said he wasn't ready to be a father, that his career was just taking off. So you both conspired to deceive my client. Objection. Ms. Parker called out. Argumentative. Sustained, James said smoothly. Mrs. Collins, after the DNA test conclusively proved my client was not the father, why did you attempt to file the birth certificate with his name? I was desperate. The hospital needed the paperwork, and Javier wouldn't return my calls. I thought if I just filed it, Andrew would eventually what? Accept the fraud. Take responsibility for another man's actions. I'm a single mother, Lacey burst out. Do you know how hard that is? I needed help, and you thought the solution was to commit fraud. The evidence continued to mount. James presented the DNA test results, complete with statistical analysis, showing zero possibility of paternity. He called hospital staff who testified about Lacey's attempts to file paperwork without Andrew's presence or consent. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of deliberate deception. Finally, Judge Chin called for closing statements. James rose first, buttoning his jacket as he approached the bench. Your Honor, the evidence presented today clearly shows a pattern of deliberate deception culminating in an attempt at paternity fraud. Mrs. Collins's actions were not mistakes or moments of panic, but calculated choices made over several months. The emails demonstrate premeditation. The DNA test proves non-paternity. In her attempt to file a fraudulent birth certificate after receiving the DNA results shows a complete disregard for both the law and my client's rights. He picked up one of the emails. Mrs. Collins wrote, once he signs the birth certificate, everything will be easier. This wasn't about love or family. This was about trapping my client into financial responsibility for another man's child. She conspired with her lover to deceive her husband, planned the deception for months, and even after being caught, attempted to commit legal fraud. These actions have caused my client significant emotional damage and could have resulted in decades of financial obligation had they succeeded. James turned slightly, gesturing toward Andrew. My client came to the hospital that day expecting to meet his child. Instead, he discovered a web of lies that destroyed his marriage and threatened his future. We ask the court to hold Mrs. Collins accountable for her actions and send a clear message that paternity fraud is not a solution to personal problems. Ms. Parker's closing argument struck a different tone. Your Honor, no one disputes that my client made serious errors in judgment, but we must consider the context. Here was a woman who had struggled with infertility, who found herself pregnant in difficult circumstances, abandoned by the biological father, and fearing the destruction of her family. Were her choices right? No. Were they made with malicious intent? Also no. She walked closer to Lacey's table. My client acted out of fear and desperation, facing single motherhood and the collapse of her marriage. She hasn't denied her mistakes. She's admitted them openly in this court. What she needs is not punishment, but understanding and a chance to make amends. Understanding, Andrew muttered under his breath. Tom squeezed his shoulder in support. Judge Chin removed her glasses, studying both parties carefully before speaking. Having heard all the evidence and testimony presented, this court is ready to render its decision. The courtroom fell silent. Lacey gripped her lawyer's arm, while Shirley leaned forward in her seat, still clutching her tissue. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds clear and convincing evidence of attempted paternity fraud. Mrs. Collins not only engaged in a months-long deception, but also attempted to submit false information on a legal document even after DNA evidence proved non-paternity. This is not a case of confusion or temporary poor judgment, but of deliberate fraud. Judge Chin fixed Lacey with a stern look. Mrs. Collins, your actions show a disturbing disregard for both the law and your husband's rights. The emails presented demonstrate that this was not a panic-driven mistake, but a calculated attempt to deceive. You involved the biological father in this deception, planned it for months, and even after being confronted with DNA evidence, attempted to proceed with the fraud. She shuffled some papers on her bench. You are hereby ordered to pay a fine of $5,000 and complete 100 hours of community service. Furthermore, this fraud conviction will remain on your record. Mr. Collins' petition for divorce is granted, and he is legally established as having no paternity rights or responsibilities regarding the child in question. The gavel struck with finality. Andrew felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he stood. Across the room, he saw Lacey crumple in her chair, rushing to comfort her. But this time, he felt no urge to help, no pull of shared history. She had made choices. Now she would live with them outside the courthouse. Autumn sunlight painted the steps golden. Tom clapped him on the shoulder. It's over, man. You won. Not about winning, Andrew said quietly. It's about justice, about truth. James approached with some final papers to sign. The divorce will be processed quickly given the circumstances. You can start fresh, Andrew. In the months that followed, Andrew threw himself into his work. The promotion he'd been working toward came through. Senior investment manager at Mitchell & Associates. He sold the house, unable to live with the memories it held, and moved to a modern apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and no trace of his past life. Tom and other friends kept him busy with golf games and evenings out. Slowly, he began to rebuild. The betrayal would always be part of his story, but it wouldn't define his future. One evening, about 6 months after the court case, Andrew stood at his apartment window, watching the city lights twinkle below. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I heard about your promotion. I'm sorry for everything. I know it's too late, but I truly am sorry. The baby's doing well. Sometimes he smiles just like you would have. I still wish things had been different. He looked at the message for a long moment. The old man might have felt a twinge of sympathy, might have wondered about forgiveness, but that man was gone, burned away by betrayal and lies. He deleted the message without responding. His phone buzzed again. Tom, this time, it said, Hey, remember the client dinner tomorrow? Sarah from accounting asked if you were coming. Andrew smiled slightly. He'd noticed Sarah's glances lately, her subtle flirtation during meetings. Maybe someday he'd be ready to trust again. But not yet, and not without careful consideration. He learned his lesson about trust the hard way. The city stretched out before him, full of new possibilities. He was stronger now, wiser, and free from the weight of betrayal. Some would call him harsh for refusing to forgive, but he knew the truth. Some actions didn't deserve forgiveness, and some people didn't deserve second chances. A plane drifted across the night sky, its lights blinking steadily. Andrew watched it disappear into the distance, thinking about journeys and destinations. His journey had taken an unexpected turn, but he'd emerged stronger, more determined, and absolutely certain of one thing. He would never allow himself to be deceived again. His new life awaited, built on truth and strength rather than lies and manipulation. The past was behind him. and the future lay ahead, unencumbered by betrayal or doubt. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.